Hello and welcome back to another update. This is your host Weeb Union and I'm back with the latest frontline developments throughout the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out to the west of Avdiivka, where the Russians are launching assaults in two separate directions. To the north of Berdishi, they've delayed an advancement towards the Ukrainian fortifications in covering the northern sector of Berdishi in an attempt to cut off the Ukrainian supply lines moving through from Novobakhmutivka in the north and down south to Berdishi through the backside. This is one of two supply lines that goes to Berdishi. The other one goes through Semenivka to the south. If the Russians are able to push through and capture the fortifications to the north of Berdishi and cut off the supply line going through the north of Berdishi, they would subsequently get a significant advantage in the battle over Berdishi, as Russians are simultaneously attacking to the south of Semenivka. Pushing through that and capturing fortification to the south of that village would allow the Russians to get firing control over the road and supply line going into Semenivka. This would completely cut off the supplies through the roads to Berdishi and Semenivka, and with the muddy weather, any off-road supply attempts would be very difficult. These assaults launched by the Russians could be an attempt to reach and cut off the supply lines to operationally encircle Semenivka and Berdishi, where the Ukrainians do have a number of fortifications and prepared defensive positions. We see that the Russians bypassed the Ukrainian fortifications to the north to push here slightly north of Berdishi and south of those positions to try and bypass the Ukrainian fortifications and capture the ones to the north of Berdishi, which would completely cut off the Ukrainian supply line to the north. However, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack and were able to hold back their Russian advances and prevent them from capturing the fortifications. We have this geolocated footage showing a Ukrainian Abrams tank moving back from a firing position within Berdishi to the back. Based on this footage, we can confirm that the Ukrainians have switched their strategies. At the start, they were launching counterattacks to try and recapture Berdishi. Now they moved to positional fighting, where they shoot off from a distance to avoid losing more of their Abrams tanks and to hold their positions, instead of launching armored counterattacks to regain positions. With this change of strategy, the Ukrainians are now suffering less losses and are able to hold back Russian advances, but the Russians are advancing nonetheless, as the pressure that they are exerting on Ukrainian fortifications are simply too much for them to handle. Not to mention that we see constant FPV strikes, not just from the Russians, but also from the Ukrainians on all positions throughout the front. More on that later. In the south by Semenivka, the Russians are launching small assault groups to try and get a foothold across the Nereva line here to the west of Orlivka. And with this, the Ukrainians are responding by launching cluster munition strikes and FPV drones on these advancing Russian soldiers. This is why there's been no clear indication of a Russian advance, but it was reported that fighting had reached Semenivka itself. There's a very small distance between Semenivka and the Russian positions by Orlivka, just a few hundred meters, and based on this we see that the Russians may enter Semenivka easily. However, gaining a foothold and staying there is the difficult part. Moving further north here in the direction of Ivanivske, the Ukrainians have started launching counterattacks towards the village after the Russian capture of it. So in the western parts to Ivanivske, the Russians have moved to a defensive position, as any attempts at advancement would be towards Ukrainian fortifications, and the Ukrainians have a concentrated force that allows them to launch counterattacks, which will make it very difficult for the Russians to advance. The current objective of the Russians here to the west of Ivanivske is to hold their line during these Ukrainian counterattacks, and in the north they are focusing on pushing through the Ukrainian fortifications and reaching Jazov Yar, which they are now only half a kilometer away from. And this is yet another section of the front where the Russians are complaining about endless Ukrainian FPV drone strikes, and this raises the question, is the strategy of small assault groups with infantry too old of a tactic now? Has it been outdated? We see that it was created by the Ukrainians during their summer offensive after the initial failure of the armored assaults, preventing them from actually gaining any territory and losing a lot of armored vehicles and tanks. In the meantime, this forced them to change strategies, and the strategy that they attempted was to launch small assault groups moving through the forest lines to avoid heavy minefields and to push through to gain for advancements and then have the armored vehicles cover them from a distance. This is the current strategy that is being used by both the Russians and the Ukrainians throughout the front line. This is why the advancements are always so small and short, and instead we see a lot of fighting, a lot of casualties for a small distance covered. However, they are able to actually cover this distance, where armored assaults would have heavy casualties with little to no gains. However, currently what we're seeing is that the advantage that was originally achieved by launching this sort of assault was that a small infantry assault group was not an important target for artillery for either side. This includes both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. The infantry assault groups has a distance between the soldiers of about 10 to 50 meters, which means that an artillery shell hitting one person would not necessarily hit the others. We saw based on this that both sides use this to avoid getting shelled at indefinitely, but instead now we're seeing that with the increased use of FPV drones, even a single soldier is an important target. So we're seeing both sides now using FPV drones on individual soldiers, even the drones that just drop grenades. And based on this, we see that these infantry assault groups end up taking a lot of casualties nonetheless, despite not being hit heavily by artillery. And if they launch larger assault groups, they get hit by cluster munitions, which covers a wide area. There's also the large artillery shells. This raises the question, how can either side launch a successful assault if small groups are not efficient and large groups are not efficient? What I'm saying is that what worked from summer 2023 to winter 2024 does not work anymore, and a new strategy needs to come if they want to see advancements across the front. What we're seeing right now is attritional war with heavy losses over little to no gains. And this may be why the Russians are opting up for a large offensive. They may see that the deadlock at the front will only intensify and become more difficult, so they instead would like to expand to a larger section of the front. The biggest advantage the Russians have right now is their advantage when it comes to shells, manpower, and equipment, both armored vehicles and infantry equipment. But based on this, we can see that the advantage that FPV drones pose is specifically for this sort of attritional war at the front. The Ukrainians have significantly increased the production of FPV drones, but not to the point where they can launch thousands of strikes a day, at most tens to hundreds of strikes a day. In comparison, the Russians have thousands and thousands, even tens of thousands of artillery shells that they can use a day, compared to the Ukrainians currently using about 1,500 to 2,000 shells a day because of their rationing. But if they stop the rationing, they can shoot a bit more, however they'll run out quicker. But based on this, if the Russians launch a full front offensive across the whole front, in that scenario, the Russians would have such a significant firepower advantage, both to the amount of shells they can launch, an increase in the amount of vehicles and manpower, and that would significantly decrease the effectiveness of Ukrainian FPV drones, as they would not have enough, together with they not having enough artillery shells and everything else. A full front offensive would be less costly than the attritional war that they're currently undergoing. This is, of course, all hypothetical. In the meantime, a DPR official says that the sanitation zone, which was referred to by Putin, would have to be 300 kilometers long, also known as the Dnieper River. So based on this, it is increasingly likely that my analysis of sanitation zone is correct. The Russians may look to gain full control over the east of the Dnieper River, and following that they would look to launch attacks to capture the south of Ukraine by the Black Sea. Moving on to the next section, we see here to the east of Terni, the Russians have launched a small attack and have managed to advance a small bit. This very small advancement in the forest area ended with Ukrainian FPV drones striking the Russian assault group. This same thing happened here to the east of Terni with a Russian armored assault. It was a small-scale assault with a couple of infantry fighting vehicles. The Ukrainians launched a counterattack and regained the positions that they lost in the area. And with this, we see both armored assaults and infantry assaults on a small scale are hardly successful due to the mass use of FPV drones, artillery shells, anti-tank weaponry, and so on. Moving on to the north, we see here in the direction of Sinkivka, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack and regained positions in Sinkivka, pushing the Russians out of the village. And yet again, another example of how these small assaults do not work. The Russians, if they want to actually win this war, they would need to push with a larger assault, and all of these small assaults end up in positional fighting. They may advance and capture a few villages after very heavy fighting, but they take heavy losses as well, as is reported by Russian sources. The amount of reports where the Russians claim that they're taking heavy losses in these small assaults have significantly increased since the Ukrainians started mass producing these drones in the late summer 2023. And to this point, although the Russians are taking less casualties than they did a year ago, they are still taking way more than what they are showing for. The battle over Avdiivka was the most costly event of the Russians since summer 2023. Yet we also saw that the Battle of Avdiivka itself was an overwhelming victory for the Russians, where they heavily bombarded the city and forced the Ukrainians to withdraw in a rout. So despite it being a massive success for the Russians, they took a lot of casualties. And the majority of those casualties was from Ukrainian artillery and drones, which they have limited use of. So again, the small assault groups the Russians are using is only helping the Ukrainians with the Ukrainian limited supply of ammunition and weapons.